May 1945, the Third Reich lay in ruins. All across Germany, factories burned, cities smoldered, and the symbols of Hitler's empire were being torn down. But amid the chaos, there was a quiet scramble, not for land or for glory, but for minds, the most brilliant, dangerous minds in the world. For years, Nazi Germany had poured vast resources into science and engineering, rocketry, jet propulsion, chemical weapons, and even early computers. At the center of this technological revolution stood men like Wernher von Braun, the charismatic engineer behind the V-2 rocket, a weapon that had terrorized London and Antwerp. Now, with the war lost, von Braun and his team faced a terrifying reality. The Soviets were advancing from the east, the Americans from the west. To be captured by Stalin's forces meant certain death or imprisonment. To surrender to the Americans, however, might offer survival, maybe even redemption. In the final weeks of the war, von Braun and his engineers gathered their blueprints, their tools, and their secrets. They burned what they couldn't carry and loaded trucks with what remained. Then, under cover of night, they made a fateful choice: to surrender not as soldiers, but as scientists. It was a decision that would shape the world's future, because while Germany's armies had been defeated, its science was about to be reborn under a new flag. As the Allies advanced deeper into Germany, another war began, one fought in laboratories, vaults, and secret bunkers. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union all knew that whoever captured the Reich's best scientists would inherit the future. From Peenemünde to Mittelwerk, Allied intelligence units scoured research facilities, gathering blueprints, prototypes, and personnel lists. The discoveries were staggering: jet engines decades ahead of anything in Allied arsenals, guided missiles, stealth technology, nerve agents, even crude plans for atomic propulsion. American agents from the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, compiled lists of German scientists marked urgent priority. These were men whose research had powered Hitler's war, but whose genius could now fuel America's peace. The question was moral as much as practical. Could the United States afford to ignore this knowledge, even if it came from the enemy? When Wernher von Braun and his surviving engineers were located in the Bavarian Alps, they were exhausted, half-starved, and frightened. They had destroyed much of their documentation to keep it from the Soviets, but enough remained to prove their value. Von Braun didn't deny his Nazi past. He admitted he had built weapons of terror, but he argued that his real dream was to send humanity into space. The Americans listened and hesitated, yet behind closed doors the calculation was simple. The Cold War was beginning, and knowledge was power. Within weeks, trucks were rolling west, filled with rocket parts and German scientists under American guard. The code name for the operation: Paperclip. In the summer of 1945, as Europe reeled from the war's devastation, a secret convoy of trucks crossed into American-controlled territory. On board were over 100 of Nazi Germany's top engineers and physicists, men whose inventions had once been used to destroy Allied cities. Now they were being quietly escorted toward a new life. The operation's name came from the simplest of tools, the paperclip, used to attach new personal files to the scientists' dossiers, concealing their Nazi affiliations. It was a symbolic act of erasure, one that raised profound ethical questions. How far could a democracy bend its values in the name of survival? The first group of scientists arrived at a remote facility in Texas. They were not prisoners, at least not officially. They were guests of the U.S. Army, given food, housing, and laboratories. But they were closely monitored, their mail censored, their movements restricted. Among them, von Braun quickly stood out. Brilliant, articulate, and deeply ambitious, he understood that his survival depended on proving his worth. He spoke not of war, but of exploration, of rockets that could one day reach the moon. To the Americans, he represented more than a scientist. He was a bridge between destruction and progress, between guilt and redemption. And so, quietly, the transformation began. The same engineers who had built Hitler's vengeance weapons were now being asked to build America's dream of space. History would one day remember them as heroes. But in those early days of Operation Paperclip, they were something far more complicated, survivors of a war that had ended, yet somehow never really ended at all. As the news of Operation Paperclip reached higher circles of the U.S. government, not everyone was comfortable with it. Inside the Pentagon, the State Department, and even the White House, debates raged behind closed doors. Was it right, or even lawful, to recruit men who had served the Nazi regime? Many of these scientists had been party members. Some had overseen forced labor, and a few were implicated in atrocities that bordered on war crimes. But the world was shifting quickly. Germany was now a broken landscape divided among the victors, and in the East, the Soviet Union was consolidating its power with ruthless efficiency. Reports were coming in that Soviet agents were also rounding up German engineers, offering them positions, or threatening them with Siberian exile. The message was clear. If America hesitated, Moscow would not, and so, in the name of national security, ethics were set aside. Washington quietly rewrote the scientists' records, deleting Nazi affiliations and sanitizing past crimes. Official memos spoke of utilizing exceptional German talent for the advancement of American science. In truth, it was a race for survival, not of nations, but of ideologies. The Cold War had not yet been declared, but everyone could already feel it in the air. To the American public, the scientists were invisible. There were no headlines, no interviews, no fanfare. Operation Paperclip existed in the shadows, protected by classified orders and misleading cover stories. But within the U.S. Army's research divisions, whispers spread. Whispers about German engineers working on secret rocket projects in the desert. In time, these whispers would grow into rumors. And those rumors would one day fuel one of the greatest moral questions of the 20th century. Can progress ever be clean when its roots are buried in darkness? Far away from Washington, in the dusty expanse of Fort Bliss, Texas, and the barren testing grounds of White Sands, New Mexico, a new chapter of science was quietly being written. The German scientists, once huddled in underground tunnels, now walked beneath the American sun, rebuilding the very rockets that had once been used to terrorize Europe. The V-2 rocket, the pride of Hitler's arsenal, was now dissected and reassembled piece by piece. American engineers and soldiers watched in awe as the Germans demonstrated the precision of their work. The complex gyroscopes, the liquid-fueled engines, the guidance systems that seemed decades ahead of their time. Von Braun and his team worked tirelessly, both to impress their new hosts and to secure their future. They were determined to prove their value, not as ex-Nazis, but as indispensable scientists. Yet, even as they worked, a quiet tension hung over them. Many of these men had lost everything: their homes, their families, their country. They were now stateless, neither fully trusted nor fully accepted. To the Americans who guarded them, they were both geniuses and ghosts of the enemy. There were moments of camaraderie, yes, shared meals, laughter over mechanical failures. But there was always an invisible wall between them, built from memory and guilt. Von Braun, ever the visionary, began to talk more openly about his dream, to explore outer space. He spoke to the Army officers about using rockets not to destroy cities, but to reach the stars. Some listened politely, others dismissed it as fantasy, but the seed had been planted. The same technology that had once rained destruction over London could now be the key to conquering the heavens. And so, under the scorching sun of the American desert, Operation Paperclip transformed from a desperate act of Cold War necessity into the birth of the modern space age. But for the men who made it possible, the past was never far behind. Each rocket launch carried both the weight of scientific triumph and the haunting echo of the war that had created it. While von Braun's team worked in the secrecy of the American Southwest, another drama was unfolding in the East. Soviet forces had seized entire German factories, rail cars full of blueprints, and dozens of scientists who had fallen under their control. The Soviets called their effort Operation Aviacum, a massive, overnight transfer of over 2,000 specialists from occupied Germany to the Soviet Union. These men and their families were uprooted in the middle of the night, shipped to secret research cities deep inside the Soviet Union. There, they were forced to rebuild the same kind of rocket programs they had once developed for Hitler. Only now, their new master was Stalin. Life under Soviet watch was grim. There were guards at every gate, isolation from the outside world, and endless political lectures. But even in those conditions, the brilliance of German engineering began to bear fruit. By the late 1940s, both the United States and the Soviet Union were testing long-range missiles, the direct descendants of the V-2. The same technology that had been born in Nazi Germany now fueled the nuclear rivalry of the two superpowers. The competition wasn't just military. It was ideological. Each side sought to prove not only who could build the most powerful weapons, but who could better harness the genius of their captured scientists. In the corridors of Washington and Moscow, intelligence briefings now included the names of former Nazis as assets, men who had once fought for Hitler, now shaping the destiny of the post-war world. It was an uncomfortable truth, buried under layers of secrecy and necessity. And yet, beneath the politics and the power, there was a shared irony. Both superpowers had built their future on the wreckage of Germany's defeat. The question no one wanted to ask was this: if the world's survival depended on the knowledge of its former enemies, had anyone really won the war at all? By the early 1950s, the men of Operation Paperclip had fully integrated into the U.S. military secret research ecosystem. What had begun as a quiet wartime intelligence project was now fueling the backbone of America's technological future. Von Braun's team was transferred to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, a once sleepy town that would soon become the epicenter of America's rocket age. Here, under the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, they began work on a new generation of ballistic missiles. The Redstone rocket, sleek, powerful, and unmistakably influenced by the V-2, was born from these efforts. It was intended as a weapon, designed to carry nuclear warheads, but to von Braun, it was also a stepping stone. Every new engine test, every structural improvement, brought humanity 1 inch closer to the stars he dreamed of reaching. Still, not everyone in America was at ease with the arrangement. Whispers about the Nazi scientists persisted, surfacing in newsrooms and congressional halls. Some journalists tried to dig deeper into the pasts of these men, uncovering links to SS programs, concentration camp labor, and forced manufacturing. Yet, government officials quickly silenced those stories, citing national security and Cold War urgency. America was in a race now, and in war, morality often comes second. As Redstone's engines roared to life in the Alabama sky, the engineers stood watching, not as Germans or Americans, but as men of science. The power of the rocket thrilled them. Its precision frightened them. They knew what this technology could do. They had seen cities burn before, and still they worked. Because in the new Cold War world, there was no turning back. The future, and survival, would belong to whoever could build faster, fly higher, and strike first. In October 1957, the impossible happened. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. It was a small metal sphere, just 23 inches wide, but it sent a shockwave through the world. In the United States, panic spread like wildfire. The Soviets had not only beaten America to space, they had proven their missile technology could now reach across continents. The response from Washington was immediate and absolute. America would have to match and surpass the Soviets at any cost. And the men best equipped to do it were already working in Alabama. Wernher von Braun's team, once hidden behind the veil of secrecy, was thrust into the spotlight. Suddenly, their knowledge, once controversial, was America's best hope for redemption. The U.S. Army tasked von Braun's group with developing a rocket capable of launching a satellite. Within months, they modified their existing Jupiter C missile and prepared for the attempt. On January 31, 1958, Explorer 1 lifted off from Cape Canaveral and soared into orbit. Cheers erupted across the nation. For the first time, America had reached space. But behind the celebration lay a strange truth. The same man who once pledged loyalty to Adolf Hitler was now the face of America's scientific triumph. Newspapers printed von Braun's smiling photograph, calling him a visionary. Few mentioned his wartime past, his presence at Peenemünde, or the slave laborers who had died building his rockets. Still, von Braun's dream had finally begun to take shape. The rockets that once carried vengeance now carried hope, and soon they would carry men. America's race to the moon had quietly begun, born from the ashes of war and guided by the hands of men who had seen both the heights of genius and the depths of moral darkness. In 1958, the U.S. government created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. It was the dawn of a new era, one that promised exploration, peace, and technological glory. But behind NASA's pristine white walls and bold vision stood a quiet truth. The foundation of this new agency was built by men who had once built weapons for the Third Reich. Von Braun, and more than 100 of his fellow paperclip scientists were absorbed into NASA's new space program. Their task, to design the rockets that would take humans beyond the Earth's atmosphere. To the public, they were presented as brilliant American engineers. Their accents were downplayed, their pasts erased. The files documenting their Nazi affiliations were locked away, some never to be released. In Huntsville, von Braun became a local hero. Schools were named in his honor, and the community embraced the promise of space travel. For most Americans, he symbolized progress, a man who had turned his talents from destruction to discovery. Yet, there were still those who remembered where he came from. Holocaust survivors, journalists, and moral critics often asked, "At what cost do we celebrate genius?" But history, as it often does, chose convenience over conscience. The Cold War was escalating, and the space race had become more than a scientific pursuit. It was a global stage for political supremacy. The United States could not afford to hesitate. Von Braun's Saturn rockets soon took shape, massive, awe-inspiring machines capable of sending humans to the moon. And so, the narrative was rewritten. The men of Operation Paperclip were no longer seen as former enemies, but as pioneers. America's need for victory had transformed villains into heroes, and in doing so, blurred the line between redemption and forgetting. By the early 1960s, the world was again locked in a race, not for territory, but for the heavens. The Soviets had sent Yuri Gagarin into orbit, and America had to respond. The pressure was immense, the stakes cosmic. President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress in 1961 and declared that America would land a man on the moon before the decade was out. Behind the cameras and applause, one man knew exactly what it would take to make that dream real. Wernher von Braun. Von Braun's vision had always been about space. The V-2 was, in his eyes, never meant to be a weapon of terror but a first step toward the stars. Now, with NASA's resources and America's industrial might behind him, he was finally free to pursue that vision on a scale unimaginable during the war. His new project, the Saturn V rocket, would be unlike anything humanity had ever built. The work was grueling. Thousands of American engineers joined the German scientists in Huntsville. Every day, teams tested engines, refined fuel systems, and simulated launches. Von Braun led them with the same precision and intensity he once demanded at Peenemünde. His charisma inspired loyalty, his intellect awe, but his leadership also carried ghosts. Many of the American engineers later recalled that he rarely spoke of the past. It was as if he had sealed that part of himself away. As Saturn's massive stages began to rise in NASA's assembly buildings, they stood as both monuments of progress and symbols of paradox. The same man whose rockets once rained destruction on London was now building the machines that would carry mankind to the moon. It was redemption on an epic scale, or perhaps an illusion of it. Still, the dream was too powerful to question. For von Braun and his team, the moon wasn't just a target. It was a promise. proof that even from the darkest origins, humanity could reach for light. July 16, 1969, Cape Kennedy. The morning sun shimmered on the white skin of the Saturn V. 3 astronauts, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, waited in the command module as the countdown began. Beneath them, 7.5 million pounds of thrust lay dormant, a symphony of engineering born from decades of ambition, sacrifice, and moral compromise. When the engines ignited, the ground shook. The rocket rose slowly, majestically, leaving behind a trail of fire that lit up the Florida coast. The crowd erupted in cheers, and television screens around the world flickered with awe. But in a quiet control room, Wernher von Braun stood motionless, his eyes locked on the ascending flame. For him, this was the culmination of a dream that had begun long before the war had ended. As Apollo 11 touched down on the moon 4 days later, history was rewritten in real time. "That's one small step for man," Neil Armstrong declared, "one giant leap for mankind." It was a triumph for humanity, and for von Braun, a vindication of everything he had believed in. The newspapers hailed him as the father of the American space program. His accent was no longer foreign, his past no longer relevant. He was an American hero now, yet the shadows remained. In Europe, survivors of the Mittelbau-Dora labor camp still remembered the agony of building V-2 rockets under inhuman conditions. To them, von Braun's success felt like an erasure of their suffering. They wondered how a world that claimed to value justice could so easily forget the origins of its triumph. But history, in that moment, was written by the victors, and the victors were looking toward the stars, not back at the ruins that had paved their way. The glow of the moon landing faded, but the moral questions did not. As the 1970s dawned, journalists and historians began to dig deeper into the story of Operation Paperclip. Declassified documents revealed uncomfortable truths about the scientists' wartime activities, about the camps, and about how U.S. intelligence had deliberately whitewashed their records to bring them into the country. For many Americans, it was a moment of disbelief. The man who had helped win the space race had also served a regime responsible for unimaginable atrocities. Debates erupted in newspapers and television studios. Could genius ever absolve guilt? Could a man's contributions to peace outweigh his service to war? Von Braun himself faced these questions with carefully chosen words. In interviews, he claimed he had been apolitical, that his loyalty was to science, not ideology. He insisted he had no power to stop the abuses of the Nazi regime. But to many, that explanation felt too convenient. It was hard to believe that a man of such intelligence and influence had been unaware or uninvolved. Still, von Braun's place in history remained largely untouchable. NASA, proud of its accomplishments, chose silence over confrontation. His name graced plaques, buildings, and awards. When he died in 1977, obituaries celebrated him as the man who took America to the moon. Few mentioned the slave labor that built his first rockets. Operation Paperclip had achieved its purpose. It had turned former enemies into instruments of progress. But it had also blurred the boundaries of morality, leaving behind a question that still echoes through history. In the pursuit of greatness, how much of our conscience are we willing to sacrifice? For decades, Operation Paperclip remained hidden behind the quiet veil of classified archives. It was one of those secrets that everyone in power knew, but few dared to speak about. Then, in the 1980s and 1990s, a flood of newly declassified documents pulled back the curtain. What had long been whispered in academic circles was suddenly undeniable. The U.S. government had deliberately altered, sanitized, and in some cases, erased the Nazi pasts of dozens of scientists. The revelations shocked a new generation of Americans. Names that had been synonymous with progress and heroism were suddenly recast in the light of complicity and moral compromise. The files showed that some of these men had been members of the SS, others had overseen forced labor programs, and still others had conducted experiments that defied the boundaries of humanity. It was an uncomfortable truth, especially for a nation that had built its post-war identity on moral superiority. Journalists began writing exposés. Documentaries aired on public television. Universities debated whether awards and buildings bearing those scientists' names should remain. For the first time, the public was forced to reckon with the idea that victory had come at a moral price, one that could not be neatly justified by the Cold War's urgency. Still, there were those who defended the operation. They argued that the Cold War had left no room for idealism, only survival. The Soviets had already taken their share of German scientists. Men like Helmut Gröttrup and Kurt Tank were advancing Soviet rocketry. If America hadn't acted, they said, history might have turned out very differently. And so the debate continued, between moral reckoning and pragmatic necessity, between the horrors of the past and the triumphs of the future. The documents had spoken, but the meaning of what they revealed was still up for interpretation. In the years that followed, the legacy of Operation Paperclip became a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance of human innovation and the darkness that often fuels it. For NASA engineers of the post-Apollo era, von Braun and his German team were legends, men who had made the impossible real. But for survivors of Mittelbau Dora, they were ghosts who had escaped justice under the banner of progress. Historians began to explore the psychological burden of this contradiction. Could a man like von Braun truly separate his scientific passion from the regime that enabled it? Or was the pursuit of knowledge itself blind, immoral, a force that cared nothing for the human cost? These questions haunted not only historians, but also ethicists and scientists in every field where innovation walks hand in hand with destruction. By the turn of the millennium, as NASA celebrated the anniversaries of the moon landing, new generations began to view Operation Paperclip not simply as a chapter of victory, but as a cautionary tale. It revealed how easily morality can bend when power, fear, and ambition converge. It showed that progress without conscience may lead humanity forward, but never upward. Interviews with surviving engineers in Huntsville revealed a strange nostalgia, pride in their work, but unease about the past. One American technician recalled, "They were brilliant, yes, but sometimes when they laughed about the old days, I could see something behind their eyes, something they never spoke of." Operation Paperclip had given the world satellites, rockets, and a bridge to the stars. But it had also left an invisible scar, a reminder that the boundary between genius and guilt can be perilously thin. Today, the story of Operation Paperclip stands as one of history's great paradoxes. Every time a rocket launches from Cape Canaveral, a trace of that legacy rides with it. The technology that powers modern space exploration owes its roots, in part, to men who once built weapons for a tyrant. It is a contradiction that lingers quietly beneath the roar of the engines. Museums and historians now tell the full story, not as propaganda, but as a lesson. In Huntsville, the U.S. Space and Rocket Center honors von Braun's achievements, yet nearby, plaques commemorate the victims of Dora. It is an uneasy balance between remembrance and recognition, pride and penance. And perhaps that is the only honest way to tell this story, to hold both truths at once. As the decades pass, fewer people remember the men who crossed oceans under secret deals and new names. But their work endures. In the satellites that guide our maps, in the rockets that explore Mars, and in the questions we still ask about what humanity is willing to trade for progress. In the end, Operation Paperclip wasn't just about technology. It was about what happens when a civilization, standing at the edge of ruin, chooses pragmatism over purity. It's a story of human brilliance born from moral failure, and a reminder that every great leap forward leaves a shadow behind. And somewhere, in that shadow, the legacy of Operation Paperclip still whispers, a warning written in fire and stars that victory, when bought at the price of conscience, will always come with echoes we cannot silence.